Hello and welcome to my frame loom weaving tutorial. I've made this as beginner friendly and inexpensive as I know how to, but if you have questions or more budget weaving tips, don't hesitate to comment them. This is a great option for anyone who's always wanted to try weaving but isn't ready to drop hundreds of dollars on a loom. I'm band weaving in my example, but you can try out nearly any technique aside from tablet weaving, which has its own DIY setup. So let me know if you'd like in-depth guides for more techniques. This is a list of all of the weaving words I use in this video. Feel free to screenshot it or come back to it if you forget what any of them mean. Here's everything you'll need. This frame is a canvas from a craft store with the staples and fabric removed. If you find you need something sturdier, it's often cheaper to buy canvas stretcher bars and staple or nail them together yourself. My frame probably won't survive a fourth weaving, as the tension of the string has caused the wood to splinter at the corners, hence the duct tape. The staples are pretty easy to find on the back of the frame. This is my preferred shuttle. I am using a real wooden one, but you can make your own by cutting this general shape out of cardboard or corrugated plastic. I think it's worth buying a cheap wooden one, as cardboard can be flimsy and I've had issues with plastic giving me paper cuts. I've already wound some weft onto my shuttle. You can weave with anything, even old t-shirts or plastic bags. Since I'm doing band weaving, I'm using a thin pearl cotton that matches the background of my design. If you're up for buying weaving yarn in bulk, Silk City is my preferred brand for cones. This is the yarn I'm using for my warp. You'll want something sturdy that won't stretch, so I'm also using pearl cotton. I recommend beginners avoid using animal fibers like wool. It tends to be much more fragile and it can be annoying when it pills up and gets stuck in places you don't want. This is my Heddle rod, which is just a dowel rod from a craft store. I ended up using a spare chopstick for this weaving since I find the dowels I have to be a little too long to comfortably weave with. It's definitely still possible, so I recommend you use what you have. This is a piece of folded cardstock paper that I will be using to start my weaving. You don't need one, but I find it helps me keep the starting edge neat. You can also use anything that's lightweight but has a sturdy, straight edge. These are a pair of jumbo craft sticks I'll be using as weaving swords or pickup sticks. If you need something smoother or sturdier, you can also purchase medical-grade tongue depressors. Craft sticks only work for a weaving that is narrower than the length of the sticks, but you can really use anything thin and sturdy or get actual weaving swords. This is some scrap cotton I'm using to tie up my heddles. Normally I use rayon upholstery thread since it's very thin, slippery, and strong, but it's hard to see what I'm doing with it on camera. Some people have found unflavored dental floss works well for them instead. This is fiber art after all, so you'll need a pair of sharp scissors. These are my designated weaving scissors. Using scissors on anything other than fabric and thread will dull them quickly. Later in this video, I struggle to cut my fringe evenly since this pair needs to be sharpened. I have multiple sizes of tapestry needles, but since the weaving I'm doing is very fine, I'm mostly using the embroidery needle on the right. You may also find it helpful to have a crochet hook nearby if you struggle to pick up small strings with just your fingers. The specific size I'm using is 3.75 millimeters, but it doesn't matter as long as it's comfortable for you to pick up a single string with. You're also more than welcome to use much thicker yarn than I do. I've already warped my white thread since these are pre-measured bundles and it's easiest for me to slide it onto the frame. If you're only using one color, you don't have to pay close attention to what order the strings are in, as we'll untangle them later on. On this first color, I've just tied the two ends together so the warp will stay on my frame, but I'll still be able to rotate the strings around. Technically, you could tie the strings directly to the frame, but since you won't be able to rotate it, that will drastically reduce the length your weaving will be able to be. Since I'm doing multiple colors, I'm spacing out the threads a little at the top of the frame. In my design, I have 4 white threads before my first blue thread. I'm holding the tail at the top while I wrap it around the bottom and back up the other side. Then I secure it with 2 knots. Keep all of your knots in roughly the same end of the frame, since you won't be able to weave past these. Again, you don't need to worry about what order your strings are in at the bottom of the frame, only at the top. It's extremely important that you don't wrap these threads too tightly. You want them tight enough so that your strings aren't sliding around and falling off, but loose enough to have room to manipulate them. Your warp will get shorter over time because while you add weft, the warp has to travel farther and farther to go over and under the strings. I'm going to keep wrapping these around according to my pattern. I recommend only doing one color at a time, so I am being sure to leave room for where the other colors go. To secure this at the end, I tie several knots onto the last loop I wound. I recommend tying the same colors together as the tension is more likely to slip if you tie the end to a different color. Repeat this process for all the colors you want in your warp. This is the step that I've found people struggle with the most. Don't forget, it's okay for it to take many tries to get right, and I encourage you to take a break if you're getting frustrated. This specific arrangement is just for plain weave. If you want to use a different structure, you'll have to modify it, which I can go over in a future video. I am weaving in this first craft stick in an under-over pattern, or up-down, depending on which makes more sense to you. The first string goes under the stick, and the second one goes on top. It does not matter which side you start on. I'm just right-handed. It might be helpful for you to space the strings farther apart at the top of the frame. I grab the strings in groups of 2 because I can hold the strings on top with a finger so they don't slide off. You might find this easier to do with a tapestry needle, and you can slide in the craft stick once you've grabbed all the strings. This is also where the crochet hook might come in handy if you have a tough time grabbing the strings. The second craft stick is much more difficult. Every string that goes over the first stick needs to go under the second stick. If it went under the first stick, it should go over the second. Pay close attention to the order of colors your strings should be in, as it's very easy to get them twisted into the wrong order. Again, it might be helpful to pick up the lower strings with a crochet hook. If the second craft stick was easy to put in, you have the option to skip this step and weave by removing it and putting it back in. This is much more common in tapestry weaving since the warp is typically more spaced out. There's 2 ways you can tie your heddle. The first is more beginner friendly, but it can get bulky pretty fast, so you definitely want a thin string. You're going to tie enough loops so that you have 1 loop for each string that is on top of the second stick. I measure the first loop around my hand. You want all of the loops to be close to the same size, but it's okay if they're not perfect. Before you tighten the knot, you can gently slide it around to get it in the correct spot. Grab the first string on top of the second stick, then slide one of your loops halfway under it. Fold the loop in half and slide in the rod to secure it. Do the same thing for all of the following strings that are on top of the second stick. You can also use the crochet hook here. If you decide to use this method, once you finish, you can skip to this timestamp. The second method uses less string, but it's trickier to get a consistent length. Tie the tail of your string to the rod. It doesn't matter what kind of knot you use as long as it's secure. You want this string to be long enough that you aren't running out constantly, but not so long that it gets tangled. I usually find a yard comfortable to work with, but this might be different for everyone, and you'll be able to add more if you run out. Pick up the first string that's on top of the second stick. I did not do a great job of keeping this one in frame, but it's easier to see what I'm doing for the ones after it. Pull your heddle string all the way under your warp string. Wrap this string around the rod and secure it with a single knot. You can adjust the length of this by pulling the tail up and down to slowly tighten it. You want to tie your rod roughly an inch away from your warp. If it's too long or too short, it'll be very hard to weave with. Here's my loom from the side so you can see why it needs to be this length. Repeat this for all of the strings that are on top of the second stick. Just like the first method, you want all of your strings to be tied roughly the same length away from the rod. I find it helpful to lift the rod up and push down on the warp with my pinky finger to check. If you run out of string, you can secure it the same way I'm finishing off my string normally, and tie on a new one the same way you did the first one. I tie a few extra knots onto the last string. It doesn't matter how you do this as long as it's secure. I start by sliding my Heddle rod over the second craft stick. This lets me both check if I've tied it correctly, and it's easier for me to untangle the warp with the edge of the stick. Then I slide the second stick down to the bottom of my frame. It probably won't slide down easily, so if it gets stuck, you'll want to pull your warp apart like I'm doing to get it to untwist. There aren't any actual knots in your warp that you need to untangle, just a lot of twisted thread. Take your time with this, and don't pull on the stick too hard, as that will just make your whole warp rotate. Once you've gotten it close to the bottom, you can slide your Heddle down and then the first stick. This should be relatively easy, as you've already gotten most of the twists in this section out. Grab all your warp strings and hold the bottom of the frame firmly. You can then rotate your warp by pulling it upwards, which will also bring your sticks back up to the top of the frame. You can then repeat the untangling process for this new section of warp. Repeat these steps until the knots you tied while winding on the warp are close to the bottom of the frame. You don't need to untangle your warp all the way up to the knots, as depending on how long you want your fringe, you won't be weaving right up against them. I like a longer fringe, so I have a few inches of space left. You can now slide everything back to the top of the frame without rotating the warp, and remove your second stick as you won't be needing it past this step. Congratulations on making it this far, now you finally get to weave! I will just be going over plain weave basics in this video, but if you're interested in trying the Baltic pickup designs I'm using this warp for, I have a second video just for that. I don't recommend Baltic pickup for beginners, as it's notoriously confusing to work with, but I certainly won't stop you from trying. I'm opening my first shed by lifting up the Heddle rod. I find the Heddle rod doesn't lift up all the strings cleanly on this stance of a weave, so I tend to go through each string that's raised and make sure it's actually one of the ones that's tied up. I'm also bracing my wrists on the sides of the frame so I can get enough tension without taking the whole frame with it. You can check that you've done this correctly by sliding your hand up to the craft stick. If you get stuck on one of the Heddle strings, then you've missed a string that you need to pick up, and if you've grabbed a string that is also on top of the craft stick, you have one you need to lower. I picked up some extra strings on purpose to show you what that looks like. In the first shed, we're only putting in the piece of cardstock. The second shed is opened with the craft stick. I find it helpful to turn it on its side so it creates a gap for me to reach my hand into. Then you have to work this gap in front of the Heddle rod, which you can usually get pretty easily just by pulling the gap open. This is what it looks like from the side. Now you can insert your shuttle and pull against the piece of paper to get the warp to even out. Pull it through, but make sure you leave a little tail of string on the other side. Wrap this tail around the last string, then pull it back through the same shed and up somewhere in the middle of the weaving. This is called burying your ends. If you tied a knot, it would be very visible, and you'd be able to feel it while handling the weaving. Open up your first shed again with the Heddle rod and pull the shuttle back through. When pulling the string tight, you want to be very careful not to pull it too tight. If it's too loose, you'll have loops at the edges of your weaving. If it's too tight, the edges of your weaving will slant together. Don't worry too much about getting this perfect, you'll get better at it with practice. Keep repeating, alternating the first and second sheds, and you have a plain weave. The number of mistakes you keep in your weaving is entirely up to you. I often have many small errors because I have the experience to be able to tell when someone will or won't notice something, but I'll still unravel large mistakes. There's two ways you can unravel your weaving. One is by weaving in reverse, which I recommend if your error is only a row or two back. If you put your shuttle back through the shed you already opened, it will pull the warp out. This is also how you'll be able to tell you opened the wrong shed. The second is by cutting your weft and pulling it out. I usually get a tapestry or embroidery needle to help me with this step. If you pull your warp apart, you can see the weft strings in the middle. This works best if you're unraveling a complicated design or have a lot of rows to undo. Depending on how large your weaving is, you may run out of weft. Once your weft string is no longer long enough to reach the other side of your weaving, bury in the end the same way you did when starting your weaving, by wrapping the tail around the last warp and pulling it back into the shed you just had open. Open your next shed and pull the shuttle through, making sure you still have a tail on the other side. Bury this end as well. Once you weave a little farther, you will be able to just trim these tails off. There are so many ways you can finish your weaving that I could spend an entire video just going over the different techniques. I personally prefer the lock-in stitch, so that's what I will be demonstrating here. I recommend doing this when you have at least an inch of weaving, but you still have your weaving on the loom. Can do it after you've cut your weaving off, it's just a lot trickier. Remove the straight edge from your warp. Take an extra piece of string that's comfortable for you to work with. Again, I usually use about a yard. Grab the first two warp strings. Ideally, you want one string that went over your first weft and one that went under your first weft. Tie 2 half hitch knots around it. I always think of a half hitch as making a 4 shape on top of the warp and then pulling the string up through the hole of the 4. This first one will be the hardest to do, as if you pull too hard it will slip off, so I recommend holding the tail. Push this knot up against the weft. Tie 1 half hitch knot around all of the following pairs of warps. Unfortunately, the footage I recorded for this didn't save. On the last pair, tie a second knot. Trim off any excess. Take a tapestry needle or embroidery needle and weave it into the first shed. I'm using an embroidery needle since my warp is so dense. My tails are usually very short, so I find it easier to weave in the needle first and then put the string through the eye and pull it through. Do this for both sides and trim the remaining tails. Once it starts getting difficult to weave with the space you have between your heddle and your weaving, you need to advance your warp. This is essentially the same as when we untangled the warp, just easier since there shouldn't be any more tangles. Grab your weaving and slide it down. You don't want to slide it all the way down to the bottom of the frame, since that will both be difficult to weave at and will likely cause a little distortion in your warp. Then slide your craft stick and heddle rod back up to the top of the frame. To finish, cut your weft and weave in the tail. Now you can remove the craft stick and the heddle. For either of the tie-up techniques, you can slide the stick out and then pull out the strings or loops. Do the lock-in stitch or your preferred finishing technique at this end as well. When you cut your weaving off, make sure to hold the warp as it's likely under a lot of tension and will spring off once you start cutting. I'm trimming my fringe to be even on both sides and line up with the supplemental fringe I added into the weaving. This will be much easier if your scissors are sharper than mine. I cut down the footage a lot so you don't have to watch me struggle to make it even. Since scissors will push the thread away while you're cutting, trim a little at a time and check often how even your line is. If you have a rotary blade and mat, you can also cut your fringe that way. In order to get my fringe the same length on both ends, I fold my weaving in half and line them up. Now you can enjoy your weaving. This channel is brand new and I've got a long list of projects and tutorials I'd like to upload, so if you enjoyed this or just learned something, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching!